So after this period of exploitation, really there needed to be the idea of, if we're going to continue, we've got to kind of figure these things out. So there's finally a change in philosophy, and we start to get to the point of conservation. But in order to understand something like conservation or sustainability, we really have to we have to study it. We have to understand it. And so we had to have people who were willing to understand natural resources. So, just like we talked about, the idea before was the idea of use it up and move on, and that we had this endless source of resources. But we know that led to ideas that were problematic. So then we needed some visionaries. We needed to have some people who really started bringing these ideas to our attention. And even the earliest presidents saw a need for conservation. Both Washington and Jefferson, in the areas that they lived in Virginia, both implemented contour farming, which is a technique to prevent soil erosion. But then George Perkins Marsh, he was a diplomat, naturalist. He was a big pioneer in the natural resources movement, and he wrote Man and Nature in 1864, and it spoke to the fragility of nature and the abuses of natural resources, and the idea that man has to coexist with nature because man is a part of nature and not just use nature. Another one of the visionaries and kind of these first pioneers into natural resources was John Muir. John Muir nowadays is best known as the founder of the Sierra Club. But back in 1867, he walked from Indiana all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. I assume your first question there would be, why would he do that? Because he wanted to. Because he wanted to see the world. Because he loved nature. Because he enjoyed being out in the outdoors and enjoyed what the land had to offer him. He eventually moved to California because of the beauty of the Yosemite Valley and other places. He devoted his life to the preservation of forest land and was one of the key people who lobbied for the creation of national parks, including Yosemite, Yellowstone, and Sequoia national parks. He founded the Sierra Club in 1892, which is a politically active conservation group focusing on the preservation of natural areas. So I include the Sierra Club logo here on the left where it says explore, enjoy, and protect the planet. And that's still echoing the ideas of John Muir, somebody who really enjoyed what the planet and what these ecosystems and what nature had to offer him, but also believed in protecting it. So then, in terms of our understanding of natural resources as a society, there's really 4 waves that we're going to focus on, although the 4th wave is not as much of a wave as the other ones, but let's get into it. So the first wave is from 1900 to 1909, or basically the first decade of that century. And so our main figure during this time is going to be Teddy Roosevelt, who was the 26th president. And he was concerned about depletion in the Great Lakes states and excess water use in western states. And he is somebody who enjoyed the outdoors, spent time in California with John Muir, hiking around areas, understood the beauty and the resource that we had, and really decided he wanted to be an environmental president. During his time, he and Gifford Pinchot, who was the head of the U.S. Forest Service at this time, they work on doing natural resources inventories. They're figuring out how to, they basically almost tripled, they at least doubled, if not tripled, the amount of acres in national forests during this time. Really just an environmentally conscious president. Hosted a conference on natural resources. He He had a natural resources commission. They conducted the first natural resources inventory in the United States. So extremely conscious of what natural resources could offer us. And so up above here, oops, sorry. There we go. Up above, this is Roosevelt and John Muir in Yosemite. And then this quote, "To waste, to destroy our natural resources, to skin and exhaust the land instead of using it so as to increase its usefulness, will result in undermining in the days of our children the very prosperity which we ought by right to hand down to them amplified and developed." And that's just another really great quote and really great kind of ethic behind the idea of sustainability, the idea of using things, but increasing the usefulness, but then also making sure to prepare it for those future generations and to not waste or destroy it. So our other big figure during this first wave is Gifford Pinchot, who I mentioned earlier was the chief of the Forest Service under Teddy Roosevelt. And there are there's a video here on this link, and then here is a article about Gifford Pinchot to give you a little bit more information. But Gifford Pinchot, basically, he studied in Europe and learned the ideas of how to basically bring forest management and the ideas of forest management, which they had in Europe because they've been doing it for a while, but we did not have here, and bring those ideas to the United States. He helped. He was the founder of the first professional organization for foresters, the Society of American Foresters, and really brought in just ideas of sustainable forestry. And he's credited with a saying, "The greatest good for the greatest number in the long run." And that it's another one of these quotes that I put into this lecture where it really addresses the idea of sustainability and of conservation and of using things wisely. The greatest good for the greatest number, being able to provide as much as we can for as many people as we can, but for the long run, making sure that we're doing it for a long period of time. We want to be able to do it in perpetuity. We want to be able to hand it down to future generations. The one thing that was a little bit of a negative drawback with Pinchot and Roosevelt is that eventually they were at odds a little bit with MUIR over basically in 1916, I want to say, they dammed up Hetch Hetchy Valley in Yosemite to provide water to the city of San Francisco. And Yosemite was a national park at that time, and John Muir was upset because it was a national park and it shouldn't have dams on it, but there were no rules saying there shouldn't be any dams on it. And Pinchot and Roosevelt were fighting this idea of conservation and using this area, and Muir didn't want it, and so we end up getting this kind of split in environmentalism and in environmental thought, which you can still see kind of to this day of kind of preservation versus conservation, and this idea that that certain places should be preserved and enjoyed and just left alone, whereas there's other areas that need to be used and need to be managed aggressively and used for their resources. And that led to kind of a fracture in terms of natural resources. So just some quotes from Pinchot about his ideas of management and his thoughts and the way he saw it. Kind of the ones that stick out to me here. To waste timber was a virtue, not a crime. There would always be plenty of timber. The lumbermen regarded forest devastation as normal and second growth as a delusion of fools, and as for sustained yield, no idea had ever entered their heads. And so he's just really annoyed at the idea that nobody understood the idea of how the ecosystem worked and how forestry actually worked and how these areas, how to take care of them properly so that they would be able to sustain themselves over time. But without natural resources, life itself is impossible. From birth to death, natural resources transform for human use, feed, clothe, shelter, and transport us. Upon them we depend for every material necessity, comfort, convenience, and protection in our lives. Without abundant resources, prosperity is out of reach. And so Pinchot is a real driver behind the ideas of sustainable forestry and the ideas of just the good sustained yield use of natural resources without forsaking future generations of that natural resource. And so really trying to show you here down here at the bottom right, I've got a video really goes in depth on Hetch Hetchy Valley and the preservation versus conservation ideas of using Yosemite National Park for a dam, because this picture here on the left, that's what Hetch Hetchy Valley was before, and then this is Hetch Hetchy Valley once it's dammed up. And John Muir was definitely on the side of preservation, that this beautiful place, that he and a lot of people agree Hetch Hetchy Valley was just as beautiful as the Yosemite Valley, and they wanted it left alone, left as part of the national park, not used for this damming. But the conservationists led by Pinchot and Roosevelt agreed with the city of San Francisco, who thought this was the best place to get water, and so they dammed it up. And the whole thing starts out with the fires of the earthquake of 1906 in San Francisco, followed by the subsequent fires that then basically burned the city to the ground. And then with the city's growing population and the need for water to put out fires and feel protected in the future, that's how we end up with this dam in Yosemite National Park. And the other thing about it is there was no National Park Service at this time. So this event basically is one of the big drivers for the National Park Service being founded in 1916, and then putting in rules that say that there are no dams allowed within national park boundaries. Our second wave then has Franklin Roosevelt as one of the main figures. So of course they have he has the same last name as Teddy Roosevelt from the first wave. They are cousins. And so Franklin Roosevelt, when he takes power and becomes president, he establishes a natural resources board. He completes the second natural resources inventory, and that inventory identified some serious problems. And then Roosevelt, who was president during the Great Depression, had a need, or felt like there was a need to put people to work, because there were great numbers of people unemployed and problems stemming from the Dust Bowl. So he, and along with people in his cabinet, came up with the great idea of founding the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and coming up with all these different ideas or ways to implement natural resources policy. So if I could define these waves, the first wave that we talked about before, I would say that's the kind of the Enlightenment period, the idea of bringing knowledge and figuring out what we had in terms of natural resources. We do the first inventory. Pinchot starts talking about sustainable forest management. We start having national parks and national forests. So it's really this idea of this is what we have, and let's learn about natural resources in the first wave. The second wave now is the idea of, okay, we have these natural resources. There's some issues within them. Let's try some different ideas. and let's try to implement some work on these lands. So we've got the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. We have the Soil Conservation Service, which nowadays is called the Natural Resources Conservation Service. They had the Prairie State Forest Project, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they also had the North American Wildlife and Resource Conference. So there's a lot of work and projects and ideas being shared during this point where they're trying to do things for natural resources. And especially the Civilian Conservation Corps was extremely successful. The other projects were successful as well, but the CCC, if you go to national parks and national forests, you're still seeing work and still seeing some of the work done by the CCC back during this era. I mean, you're seeing fire lanes and trails and bridges and roads and all these things that were constructed by the CCC during this time, because Franklin Roosevelt had the idea that, we have all these things that could be done to make these areas more accessible, to make these areas more usable for people, and to fix some of these problems that we have. And we have all these people who need work. All right, well, the government's going to put them to work, and that's how we're going to get it done. And with all these different projects, they were able to really implement some management of natural resources for, for the first time in a large amount, they were able to implement natural resources management. Another big figure during this second period is ALDO Leopold, who we've already talked about a couple times, considered by many to be the father of wildlife ecology and the United States wilderness system as well. He was a conservationist, a naturalist, a forester, a philosopher, an educator, a writer, and an overall outdoor enthusiast. In fact, I believe Leopold died while fighting a forest fire. A guy who was just very passionate about the outdoors. But among his best known ideas is the land ethic, and I have included a link here where you can read more about the land ethic and what it means. But basically, it's his idea of an ethical, caring relationship between man and nature. Leopold was a graduate of the Yale Forestry School in 1909, and he pushed for the creation of the first wilderness area in 1924, which was a portion of the Gila National Forest. And you can see that down here. Here's the Gila National Forest and the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Area attached to it. He's also considered to be the father of wildlife management. He was the first professor of game management nationwide, and that was at the University of Wisconsin in 1933. He was from Wisconsin. After his death in 1948, there was a book called a Sand County Almanac that was published containing his essays. I think, and a lot of people think, it is the quintessential writing about natural resources. If you are interested in natural resources, if you love natural resources, if you love the outdoors, if you are a natural resources or forestry major, it is a book that you need to read. It's one of the most respected books about the environment. It's just a collection of his observations and his thoughts on nature, and they are really get to the ideas of sustainability and conservation and ethics within natural resources. The third wave, 1960 to 1980, this is when, so our first wave, we figure out what we have. Our second wave, we start to implement the ideas of management and what we're going to do with our management, how we're going to manage things. The third wave now is going to bring in the idea of people, getting the information to the people, to the masses, and then the idea of then laws being created to try and protect the environment, and people basically getting involved in trying to protect the environment. So during this time, this is when the conservation and environmental movement takes off. In 1962, Rachel Carson wrote a book called Silent Spring about the dangers of pesticides, specifically DDT. And this, along with some other authors and other books, really start bringing to light the problems with pollution and degradation and destruction of the environment. Another book at this time was Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bomb, where he really gets to the ideas of sustainability in talking about how the birth rate must be brought into balance with the death rate, or mankind will breed itself into oblivion, which is it's a much darker version of what we discussed at the beginning of class, where the planet's only so big, and if the population keeps increasing, what's going to happen when we start running out of things? During the same time is the first time we had Earth Day. So the first Earth Day was April 22nd in 1970, and it actually started off as a teach-in. And so what happened is some teachers in, I can't remember if it was Minnesota or Wisconsin or both, they decided that they took the day, they didn't teach their normal stuff, and they just focused on teaching people about the environment and letting people know about the environment. And the congressperson got involved with it, and that led to Earth Day being something that is celebrated every year. In 1970, we also get the establishment of the Environmental Protection Agency, because we realized that there's a lot of legislation now for the environment, but not really any agency to enforce it. So the government created the Environmental Protection Agency with the idea that they are going to be the enforcers for these new environmental policies. So here's just an Earth Day infographic, because Earth Day, it's really interesting to think about that just some teachers and students have helped create something that has lasted so long and become so much bigger than they ever thought it would be. But so this decade was during the 70s. Was a big decade in terms of the environment, but it even started in the 60s. There was the Wilderness Act in 1964, and some other acts before that, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act in 1960, where we had started to get this environmental legislation, but we really got a lot of environmental legislation during this decade, between the 70s and the 80s. And so we got things like the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires federal agencies to do environmental assessments. And if those environmental assessments say that they're going to negatively affect the environment, then they have to do an environmental impact statement that says how they're going to affect the environment and what they're going to do to basically make up for it. We get the Clean Air Act in 1970, 72, the Marine Protection Act. 72, we also get the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, Rodenticide Act, which is a direct result of the work of Rachel Carson in her book Silent Spring. 1973, we get the Endangered Species Act, which I always like to mention the idea that the Endangered Species Act doesn't actually protect any species, but what it does is it protects the habitat in which the species lives in. And I think that's an important distinction when we talk about habitat later on in the class. In 1976, we get the National Forest Management Act, which was a big deal because they had been running under the same rules since, I think, like the last Management Act for forests in the government was 1897 before that. In 1977, we got the Clean Water Act because some rivers were so polluted that the rivers were actually catching fire. And we get the 1978 National Energy Act, where we finally start looking at alternative uses for energy. And so That's a lot of laws. It wasn't even all of them. There were way more environmental protection statutes during this time, and so here's a list with even more of them just during the decade from the 70s to the 80s. That takes us to the fourth wave, which is basically 1980 to the present. So the first wave, we figured out what we had and what we were going to try and do with these natural resources and how we were going to try and start thinking about some of these ideas. In the second wave, we really start implementing these ideas and implementing management on a large scale on some of these areas. The third wave, we get the information out to the people, information out to the masses, and then really get a lot of environmental legislation to try and protect these areas. And then we get to the fourth wave, and really, we've just seen this kind of up and down, not really accomplishing much period of time. We've got a lot of ideas that it's the environmental protection is counterproductive to the economy, and we have modern society on its unsustainable course with its growing population. We do get some big events, like we get the World Commission on Environment and Development, and we get the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and we get the Paris Climate Accords, and we have Earth Day as an annual event. But in terms of when you think about the idea of what technology we have available to us now, and the information that we have available to us now, and how many people are at universities and studying and learning about natural resources and understanding natural resources, we really haven't accomplished all that much in this fourth wave. And so to me, this fourth wave, really what stands out to me about the fourth wave is the idea that now we have all the technology, we have all the knowledge. Why haven't we figured out how to do this more efficiently? Why haven't we figured out how to move away from non-renewable resources? And I think we're really on our way to almost starting a fifth wave, and that fifth wave being where we finally get it, and people seeing that we need to protect the environment, and we need to learn how to use these alternative fuel sources and energy sources, and we need to go away from things that aren't renewable, and how we need to just get more efficient with the way that we use things. I think we're heading towards that fifth wave, but currently not really using the information and technology we have available to us to improve the situation since the 70s and the 60s and 70s before us. So, information is key, and let's keep these questions in mind for the rest of the class. How do we go forward to utilize natural resources and conserve them simultaneously? So how do I, this gets to a principle we're going to talk about soon called multiple use sustained yield. How do I get the maximum use out of something while also making sure I'm not destroying that natural resource that I'm using, and not only am I not destroying it, but I'm making its environment or habitat even better than when I first got to it. And then what is the role of science-based solutions in problem solving? So how do we use science to help us solve these problems? Because that's what science is there for, and that's the beauty of science, is to figure out these problems. How do we solve these problems? That's what science is good for. Science is going to be the one that kind of lights the way and shows us the path, and then it's up to us to use that information and be able to determine how best to manage some of these areas and how best to use these areas in order to make sure that they are, for us, used to the used in the most efficient way, and then also set aside to be able to be used in the future. The way I like to summarize it, and the phrase I like to use a lot, is I can't change the past, I can't predict the future, but I can learn from the past. I can see and understand what needs to happen for the future, and I can do and act now. And that's kind of the way to look at it. So in summary, really important to understand the idea of sustainability and conservation, and the fact that we're going to use ideas from ecology to really set forth how we're going to manage. We went through a long period of resource exploitation in this country, but then through these 4 waves, we really get these ideas of ideas in need for conservation, and start thinking about sustainability. And then just the idea that we need to think about how we're going to do this, and how we're going to manage natural resources in a way that we can improve upon what has happened so far. And so that is our first lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it.